the time my sister-in-law stood in my doorway crying that she had been left out, the whole room already knew what she had done. I remember looking at the untouched centerpiece in my hands, hearing nothing for a beat, and thinking, so this is what fairness sounds like when it finally comes back. My name is Nora, I'm 29, and I run events for a boutique hotel in Charleston. I make other people's milestone days look effortless while quietly swallowing whatever chaos it takes to get there. I know how seating charts can start wars. I know how flowers can become weapons. And I know that the meanest women almost never raise their voices. They smile. They tilt their heads. They let the damage bloom in public and call it a misunderstanding. That was Greer from the first day my brother Julian brought her home. She had one of those polished voices that made rude things sound expensive. At dinner, she complimented the roast, laughed at all the right moments, and then asked me in front of everyone whether event work was my forever plan or just something I did while waiting for real stability. She said it like she was asking about the weather. My father went still. My mother gave me that little glance mothers give when they want you not to ruin a meal. Julian kept smiling like none of us had heard it. That became the pattern. Tiny cuts, carefully placed, never enough for Julian to call it what it was. When they got engaged, Greer announced it at my grandmother's memorial luncheon. Not after. Not privately. During dessert, my grandmother had left me her pearl comb, the one every woman in our family had worn on her wedding day for generations. While my mother was still thanking people for coming, Greer stood up, lifted her champagne flute, and said she was so grateful life still gives us beautiful reasons to gather. Then she flashed her ring and everyone gasped because people will always follow sparkle before grief if you hand it to them fast enough. I remember my Aunt Arden whispering, "Not here," under her breath. Greer heard it. She smiled wider. After that, wedding planning took over the family calendar. She wanted a historic estate, custom calligraphy, a weekend itinerary, color-coded wardrobes, and professional content capture from multiple lifestyle angles, which is how she described the videography package like she was launching a brand instead of marrying my brother. My parents dipped into savings to help. I took unpaid days off during peak season to help them manage vendor calls after. Greer fired her first coordinator for low elegance energy. 3 days before the wedding, she sent out a revised schedule with a note in the family group chat. She wrote that her side was used to formal events, and she appreciated anyone who could rise to the occasion. Then she added that she knew Julian's family was more freestyle. No one replied for almost a minute. Then my mother wrote, "We'll all be there on time." I stared at my screen long enough to feel my neck burn. Freestyle. That's what she called the people who drove across 2 states, booked rooms they couldn't really afford, altered dresses, bought gifts, and rearranged jobs for her. At the rehearsal dinner, she thanked every out-of-town guest by name except my father's sister and her sons. She praised her college roommates for being the backbone of the weekend, while my mother sat there with swollen feet from standing all day and still said nothing. Later, in the parking lot, I heard one of Greer's bridesmaids ask if my side of the family was always this touchy. Greer laughed and said, "They just don't love structure." The next day, we showed up anyway. Beautiful, pressed, on time, my mother in sage silk. My father in the tie Greer picked, me in a dress that pinched under the ribs because she had changed the shade twice. We took the photos we were told to take. We stood where we were placed. I fixed a boutonniere. I found missing vows. I tracked down a vanished ring box that turned out to be in Greer's own tote. I did what I always do. I kept things moving so the woman creating this dress could glide above it and look radiant. Then came the first strange thing. During cocktail hour, I saw the content team pulling Greer's sorority sisters aside for sunset shots near the fountain. I saw them line up her cousins on the south lawn. I saw them gather her parents and her aunt from Boston. But every time one of ours drifted close, an assistant would murmur, "We'll get another variation later." Later never came. I pulled Julian aside and asked quietly whether there was a separate plan for his family portraits. He looked over my shoulder toward Greer, who was laughing under a string of lights, while the videographer circled her like a moon around a planet. Julian frowned and said, "I'm sure it's handled." After the wedding, life moved on. Thank you cards. New apartment. Holiday dinners. Greer acting sweet whenever there were witnesses and bored. Whenever there weren't. I stayed busy. My fiancé, Reed, and I set a date for early spring. We found an old river mill venue with brick walls, sycamore trees, and enough soft light to make everyone look forgiven. Then Greer started asking questions about the venue. Was there a bridal loft? Was there overnight parking? How many vendor passes came with the contract? Did the coordinators allow outside media? Could guests wander through the prep spaces, or were they restricted? At first, I thought she was making conversation. Then I realized she was mapping the place. 2 weeks later, Julian and Greer hosted a watch party for their wedding film. They invited both families. I almost didn't go, but my mother asked me to keep the peace, and I had spent half my life mistaking mistaking peace for silence. So Reed and I brought wine and went. The film opened with drone shots over the estate, then Greer's veil, then Greer's shoes, then Greer laughing, Greer turning, Greer hugging her mother, Greer stepping into the aisle, Greer crying, Greer dancing, Greer in sparklers, Greer in candlelight. It was gorgeous, it was polished, it was deliberate, and our family was almost nowhere. My father appeared once at the edge of a toast, blurred. My mother's shoulder passed through one frame like an accident. I was in nothing. My aunt was in nothing. My cousins were in nothing. The entire part of the day where we had supposedly taken portraits had vanished like it had been cut with surgical care. The room stayed too cheerful for too long because no one wanted to be the first person to say what all of us were seeing. Then my Aunt Arden set down her glass and asked very calmly, "Did the editor lose the groom's side of the wedding?" Greer laughed. Not nervously, not apologetically. She laughed like the question was charming. "Oh my gosh," she said, hand over chest. I didn't even notice. I looked at the screen, then at her, then at Julian. He didn't meet my eyes. That was the first crack in him. Tiny, but there. Later that night, I texted Greer politely and asked whether she could send over the sibling portraits and any clips with my parents, since the final film seemed to focus more on atmosphere. I worded it like a professional request because anger gives women like her something to work with. She replied the next morning, "What sibling portraits?" I stared at the message until Reed took my phone from my hand and read it himself. I typed back that I distinctly remembered the stone staircase, the bouquets, her asking me to move left because the train needed to show. She sent a thumbs up and wrote, "I think you might be mixing it up with the rehearsal." That was when I knew it wasn't carelessness. Carelessness apologizes. This was erasure with a manicure. I said nothing at family dinner the next Sunday when Greer brought a charcuterie board and acted like a lifestyle account in human form. I said nothing when she asked my mother whether she preferred to sit near the kitchen because she seemed more comfortable where things are happening. I said nothing when she asked me, in front of everyone, if wedding planning for myself felt less stressful than managing other people's budgets. I smiled. I sliced bread. I let her think the ground under her feet was solid. And because life is funny in the meanest ways, that was the same dinner where she found out one more detail about my wedding. Our videographer wasn't just good. He was mine. If you're listening while folding laundry, driving home, or hiding in your bathroom for 5 minutes of peace, stay with me. Some silences are not weakness. They are staging. And sometimes the kindest face at the table is already moving the last piece into place. Alright, now let me take you back. The real shift started months before my wedding, when Greer cornered me in the powder room at my parents' anniversary dinner. She closed the door behind her and looked at my reflection instead of my face. "I heard you booked Marlowe Media," she said. I did. Her smile sharpened. "Interesting, they're selective." There it was. Not congratulations, not excitement, ownership. Marlowe Media had filmed a charity gala at my hotel the year before. I'd worked that event with their lead producer, Willa, solving problems without letting either touch the guest experience. Weeks later, when Reed proposed, Willa sent me a handwritten card and said if I ever got married, call her first. I did. Greer wanted that team. I knew it instantly. She leaned against the sink and said, "I just hope you're not expecting the same cinematic treatment I had. Different venues photographed differently." I met her eyes in the mirror. "I'm expecting my guests to exist in the footage. That's enough for me." For a heartbeat, her face changed. Only a heartbeat. Then she laughed lightly and opened the door. "You're still so sensitive, Nora." Sensitive. That word always shows up right after a woman has done something cruel and needs you to carry it quietly. I walked back into the dining room and sat beside Reed. Under the table, he covered my hand with his. He didn't ask what happened. He just pressed once, like a promise. That night, I called Willa, and for the first time, I stopped asking for fairness and started planning for symmetry. Willa did not gasp, cheer, or feed the plan with the kind of excitement that turns revenge sloppy. She listened. That was one of the reasons I trusted her. When I finished telling her what Greer had done, she stayed quiet for a second and asked, "Do you want humiliation or do you want balance?" "Balance," I said. "I want her to feel chosen all day and missing forever after." Willa gave a low hum, almost thoughtful. "That can be done." We met for coffee 3 days later with my coordinator, Sella, who knew how to keep a timeline so tight it could cut glass. I didn't say the word revenge in public. I didn't need to. I explained that one guest had a habit of drifting into every polished moment, and that I wanted no confrontation, no scene, no gossip trail leading back to me. I just wanted the final story of the day to be honest about who had actually held me up. Sella asked, "Do you want her managed away from key moments?" "No," I said. "Let her float close. Let her think proximity means permanence." Willa smiled into her cup. That was my first clean shift, not anger. Strategy. The next few weeks brought the rest. Greer began acting invested in my wedding in a way that felt less like sisterhood and more like surveillance. She sent links to Vail steamers I hadn't asked for. She asked whether the guest shuttle would run from the inn or the river lot. She offered to help store welcome bags at her place, which I declined. She asked if vendors had access codes for the back service entrance. That one made me pause. Our venue had a locked bridal suite, a private garden path, and a catering gate that needed a keypad code. Very few people knew that. Reed changed the code that same night. He didn't ask whether I was overreacting, he just changed it. That is one of the quietest ways love can sound. Then came the second micro twist. My mother called me on a Tuesday afternoon with that careful voice people use when they are about to hand you someone else's mess wrapped in concern. Greer had apparently been telling relatives that I was struggling with the pressure and might need to scale back the wedding because Reed and I were being practical about costs, which was news to me because our wedding was paid for, our budget was stable, and the only person obsessing over what things cost seemed to be the woman spreading the rumor. At first, I thought it was just ordinary malice. Then my cousin Rue forwarded me a screenshot from a family group thread I wasn't in. Greer had written that she hoped everyone would be understanding if certain luxuries disappeared because not every couple could afford a full production. She added a sad little line about how stress makes brides act unlike themselves and how she was trying to support me privately. Support me. By dinner, 2 relatives had texted to ask whether the videographer had canceled. One aunt asked if I still wanted the hand-lettered escort display as her gift, since maybe I needed cash instead. I sat in my car outside the hotel loading dock and laughed so hard I scared myself. Not because it was funny, because it was elegant in the ugliest way. If my wedding looked modest, she could say she had warned people. If it looked beautiful, she could claim she had offered grace. I called my father first, then my Aunt Arden, then finally Julian. He answered on the 4th ring, sounding tired. I told him what Greer had been saying. Silence. Then he said, "She probably thinks she's helping." I leaned back against the headrest and closed my eyes. "Julian, if a person pours water on your floor and then offers you towels, that is not help." He exhaled, long, worn out. For the first time, I heard not blindness in him, but fatigue. "She says your side has always resented her." "My side," I said very evenly. "There is no my side. There's the family you were born into and the wife who keeps turning us into props." He didn't defend her right away. That was new. Instead, he asked, "What do you want me to do?" There it was again, another crack. "Nothing," I said. "I'm done asking you to see it before it affects you." Then I hung up. Not because I was trying to be dramatic, but because I had finally run out of strength for the same circular heartbreak. The week of the wedding, things accelerated. Greer informed my mother that because she had to work the day before and after, she would need flexibility with lodging, which was rich considering she had not been included in the original room block. My mother, being my mother, tried to solve the discomfort before anyone could feel it. She asked if Greer and Julian could take one of the extra suites reserved for my college friends. I said no. Not loudly, not angrily, just no. My mother blinked at me like I had switched languages. I put down the seating board I was reviewing and said, "Those rooms were promised months ago. Everyone else managed their travel plans without editing mine. That was access cut, clean, quiet, final." My mother looked embarrassed, but not at me. At the request, she nodded once and didn't ask again. An hour later, Greer texted me directly. "Wow, guess I misunderstood the kind of family this was." I read it twice, then replied, "You understood correctly." Nothing else. Calm compliance is a beautiful thing when the other person is waiting for a fight. They ended up booking a last-minute room at a bland highway hotel 20 minutes away. I heard about it from 3 different relatives because Greer made sure everyone knew she had been displaced. What she didn't know was that Selah had already flagged her as a boundary risk. Her name was quietly removed from vendor contact sheets, prep room access, transportation updates, and the emergency decision list. If she asked a vendor a question, the answer would be a smile and a redirect. No one announced it. The day would simply move around her. The rehearsal dinner took place under low lights in the Mills barrel room with old brick, warm candles, and the kind of soft jazz that makes even tense people look reflective. Reed's father cried during his toast. My best friend Holland nearly dropped her champagne when she stood up too fast. My niece fell asleep in my lap through dessert. Greer arrived 20 minutes late in a white blazer. Not cream, not beige, white. A little too bright under candlelight to be an accident. People noticed. Of course they noticed. But because women are trained from birth to preserve a room at our own expense, no one said anything at first. Greer floated from table to table, kissing cheeks, apologizing about work, explaining how rushed she was. Then she reached me, bent down, and said, "I hope this is okay." I barely had time to change. I looked up at her, smiled, and said, "It makes sense. Attention always seems urgent for you." Her face didn't crack, but Julian's did. He was standing behind her holding 2 water glasses, and I watched the exact second he saw the blazer not as fashion, but as pattern. It was there in his eyes. Not outrage, recognition, the worst kind. The kind that arrives late and drags shame behind it. Greer turned toward him as if expecting support. He handed her 1 glass and said quietly, "You could have worn literally anything else." That silence afterward tasted different different from all the others. He wasn't shielding her anymore. She laughed it off, but her mouth went tight. The next morning, rain threatened and then passed, leaving the sycamores rinsed and silver green against the brick. Everything smelled like wet earth and river stone. Willa's team arrived before sunrise. Salah clipped a headset onto one ear and turned into a benevolent dictator. Reed sent me a voice memo instead of a text, because he knew hearing him steady would help more than reading him cheerful. In the bridal suite, my grandmother's pearl comb sat beside my veil. That mattered, because this wedding was not about spectacle. It was about continuity. It was about the people who showed up, the people who carried dress bags, steamed hems, calmed nerves, tied ribbons, fetched forgotten medicine, fixed hair, packed snacks, found safety pins, and held the day together with ordinary love. Willa filmed all of it, my mother buttoning my cuffs with shaking fingers, Holland kneeling on the floor to stitch a loose hem, Aunt Arden pinning the pearl comb into my hair and kissing my temple after, Reed's little sister practicing her reading by the window, my father standing outside the suite door, unable to come in yet, wiping his eyes where no one was supposed to see, and yes, Greer too. Greer drifting near the mirror while makeup was happening. Greer stepping into the garden path just as portraits were being framed. Greer sliding beside my mother during a candid. Greer laughing too brightly near the gift table. She was everywhere. Just enough to make herself feel central. Just enough for Willa's roaming camera to catch the effort. By the reception, she seemed almost buoyant. Seen, included, reflected back at herself all day long. Then came the practical front and with it the big twist. Halfway through dinner, Selah appeared beside my chair and whispered, "We have a situation, but it's handled." I set down my fork. "What happened?" She bent closer. "Someone tried to redirect the card box pickup." Every nerve in my body went cold. Our card box, gifts, and envelope safe were supposed to leave with Reed's cousin and be logged at the inn office before midnight. Only 4 people knew the exact handoff chain. "Who?" I asked. Selah's face stayed smooth. "A vendor assistant was approached near the catering gate by Greer. She said you changed the plan and wanted the gifts loaded into Julian's car because family would handle it." For a second, all I could hear was silverware and distant laughter and the blood in my ears. Did she touch anything? No, because the assistant asked for the authorization word. Greer didn't have it. I stared at Selah. "Authorization word?" Selah gave the smallest smile. "You work events. I learn from professionals." I almost laughed. Instead, I looked across the room. Greer was at the bar, smiling at someone, one hand on the stem of her glass, as if nothing in her body had ever reached where it wasn't invited. Right person truth arrived 10 minutes later. Not from me, from Julian. He found out because the assistant, rattled and wanting to be safe, had asked Willa, who asked Selah, who informed Reed, who took exactly one look at my face and went to get my brother. I didn't hear their first exchange, but I saw the second. Julian standing rigid near the service corridor. Greer's expression shifting from offended to frightened to furious as he spoke. Then, in front of no audience worth performing for, he said something that made her go completely still. She looked around once, maybe checking whether anyone was watching. No one obvious was. That was the mercy of it. Then she left the room, not dramatically, not in tears. Just a sharp turn, a white clutch, a fast walk through the side exit into the wet dark beyond the patio lights. Julian did not follow right away. He stood there for a moment with both hands on his hips like a man discovering the shape of his own failure. Then he crossed the room and stopped beside my chair. "I'm sorry," he said. "There are apologies that arrive like bandages and apologies that arrive like autopsies. His was the second kind. Too late to save anything. Honest enough to hurt." I looked at him for a long time. "I know." He nodded once, swallowed hard, and walked outside. The rest of the night was beautiful in the way beautiful things sometimes are after the rot finally gets named. The air felt cleaner. People relaxed. My mother laughed with her full face. My father danced. Reed kissed my forehead in the middle of the floor like he had nowhere else to be for the rest of his life. The fallout chain started the next morning. Greer had gone home alone. Julian stayed with my parents until dawn, then checked out of the marriage by the end of the month. Not legally that fast, but emotionally, completely. He later told me the attempted gift redirect was not a random grab for envelopes. Greer had private credit card debt he only discovered after that night, along with messages complaining to a friend that my wedding would be insufferable unless she found a way to leave with something tangible. That part never had to become public. It was enough that the right people knew. At Thanksgiving, no one asked me to smooth things over. No one told me she meant well. No one suggested family should ignore patterns for the sake of appearances. Social gravity had shifted, quietly, permanently. 3 months later, Willa sent the final wedding film. Reed and I watched it alone first. It opened on rain drying off leaves, then my grandmother's pearl comb, then my father's hands shaking, then my mother smiling through tears, then Reed seeing me, then the vows, the dancing, the messy joy, the people who loved us with their whole bodies. It was warm and human and exact. And Greer? Not 1 second. Not at the mirror. Not in the garden. Not by the bar. Not in the crowd. Not in the glow of the dance floor or the edge of the dinner speeches or the blur of the late night laughter. Gone. Not because she had not been there. Because presence is not the same as belonging. A week after the film went out to family, Greer showed up at my house carrying a bakery box and the kind of expression women wear when they still think presentation might rescue them. She said she had seen the video. She said she felt blindsided. She said after everything, it seemed pointed. I looked at the box in her hands and then at her face. Does it? I said. She started to talk about fairness, about misunderstandings, about how hurtful it felt to be edited out of a family moment. Behind me on the entry table, a still frame from my wedding film sat in a silver frame. My parents were laughing in the front row. Reed was turned toward me. My Aunt Arden had one hand over her mouth. My niece was asleep on Holland's shoulder in the corner. It was full of love, full of people who had earned their place. I opened the door wider, just long enough for her to see it. Then I said very gently, "Now you know how carefully that can happen." I did not yell. I did not invite her in. I did not take the cake. She stood there with her apology and her box and her own reflection finally stripped off the polished version of the story she had been telling herself. Then she turned and walked back down the path alone. Inside, Reed came up behind me and touched my waist. The house smelled like coffee and clean linen and spring rain through an open window. My phone buzzed with a message from Julian asking if we wanted dinner next week. Just us, no complications. In the living room, the film kept playing softly. The people who loved me still present, still visible, still impossible to erase.